about water and urban places. This is Ideanthro.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro. On today's episode, I would like to elaborate on a concept that I've raised a couple of times recently in some of our front of mind episodes, but not really presented in its fullest, most articulate format as best I can. Now, part of the reason I haven't been able to do that is because this concept is still forming up in my mind. And so what I'd like to do is to use this episode almost to use you as the viewer as a virtual muse here, to put this idea out here in a semi-formed format, but as best as I can currently articulate it, so that I can get some feedback, so that the process of trying to articulate as best as I can helps me to form it up further. So the concept has to do with how I'm viewing our water-sensitive industry and viewing the transition to a water-sensitive city as described by Rebecca Brown, how I'm viewing that and how I'm viewing it through the lens of complexity. So I'm going to try and set this up, and then I'm going to present to you a couple of ways I've seen proposed to solve this issue and share my current thoughts on the relevant merits and the relative merits of each of them. Context to this, we need to remember that a lot of my work in this space, like my initial work in water-sensitive urban design, has come from an asset management point of view. It's, oh my goodness, we have a lot of bioretention systems. How are we going to maintain them? How much will that cost? Oh my God, it's going to cost a lot. How do we get those costs down? And one of the things that I've started to notice here, and so there's this overall trend and feeling that I pick up, which is essentially, look, this stormwater treatment thing that we're doing, it makes sense. We understand it conceptually. We would agree with it conceptually, but my goodness, it's costing quite a bit of money to do it. Like, really? And so you can look back at previous episodes of Ideanthro where I've talked about, for particular local governments, doing some sums to figure out how much it would cost to maintain all of these assets if we could get them in the ground and built, which frankly we're taking a very long time to do. But if we did get them in the ground straight away, oh my goodness, they would cost a lot to look after. And so it got me thinking about why. And it led me to the diagram. So with this diagram, for anyone who's not familiar with it, whatever rock you've been living under in the water-sensitive urban design, water-sensitive cities world, sorry, that was a little rough. But the diagram, for anyone who's not familiar with it, starts with, essentially, it's meant to describe the progression of our cities through various stages of water management, till ultimately the bit that I couldn't fit on the page, which is the water-sensitive city, whatever that exactly is. But it starts with a water supply city. So people come and settle the land, and the first thing that you need to secure if you're a human living somewhere is a water supply. Even before food, even before shelter, water. You'll not last long without it. Then once you've got a city, pretty quickly sewerage, waste, becomes a problem. So the next stage of the city is, well, we've secured our water, but we need to do something with the waste, so we need to sewer it eventually. Whether that's through septic systems or whether that's through a centralized system, we need to do something with sewage. After that comes the drainage stage. So it's like, we've grown big enough that suddenly we're starting to get flooding problems because we've paved all these areas. That's the drain city. After that, you have a waterways city where you're starting to recognize that, you know what? We're starting to have a few negative impacts on our waterways from the drainage and from our other practices. Then you have a water cycle city, which is the first attempt to try and manage this, and it's hypothesized that a water-sensitive city down the end fixes it. What I see when I see this diagram is increasing complexity throughout the system as we move from left to right. So what I see is, off the page to the left, you have a natural catchment that obviously has all of its own complexities in the way that it behaves as an ecosystem, but the human element that's built on top of it, there's no complexity because there's no human element to it. You come along and you need a water supply. So humans begin to build infrastructure, begin to add their type of complexity to the system in order to secure their water supply. They then recognize that because they have a water supply, we need to sewer the situation. The problem here is that, wait, hang on. The water supplies cause problems because we brought new water in and we've polluted it. And now we need to do something with it. So what are we going to do? We're going to sewer it. So they add more complexity by adding a sewerage system. You went from no human settlement to one with water supply infrastructure to one with more complexity in sewerage. Then at some point we realized that, wait, hang on. We've now got big enough. Because we've got the first two right, our city is able to get large enough that we now get the third one happening, or we get the third problem, which is flooding. So then we're like, okay, how will we solve that? We're going to add some stormwater drains to the system. It's added more complexity to the system. Then we recognize, for example, that sewerage and stormwater drainage are having an impact on our waterways. And we don't particularly like that. So we're like, okay, we need to manage the impact upon waterways. So we come on and we build way more complex sewage treatment plants. We come along and start building bioretention systems. And so we add more complexity in the waterways city. And so I look at this and I wonder to myself, okay, the problem that I see day to day is this problem of it costs too much to do water sensitive urban design. If we want to treat the whole city, it's too expensive. If there's legislation, it will get people to do it, but no one wants to do it out of just, I mean, people might want to do it of the goodness of their heart, but for the most part, no one's just running out and doing it because it's one of those no-brainers, easy, cost-effective things to do. Right? There might be the odd occasion that we do that. There might have been times when we had really good financial times and there was heaps of money to burn that people wanted to do it. The reality of the situation is that at the scale of this that we need to implement with our current technologies, it's really, really, really expensive to do. So then I start looking at this and I go, well, what are the options that we would have to solve the situation? So just for a minute, just hold that in your mind for a minute there. But let's just think for a minute about what options can we brainstorm about how we'd solve the too costly problem. One of them would be to go, okay, so with bioretention systems, and this is the one that I've spent a lot of the early part of my career working on. It was a case of, well, if water sensitive urban design infrastructure is too costly to build, let's find cheaper ways to build water sensitive urban design infrastructure. Now that is sound up to a point. The point that that starts to no longer be sound is the fact that it's not just our water aspects of our cities that are encountering these problems. And certainly not just the water sensitive urban design, stormwater treatment aspects are. The reality is that even if you magically disappeared water sensitive urban design and stormwater treatment from our cities tomorrow, our local governments and our public utilities would still fundamentally be facing the same issues with cost. It's the same reason water utilities are having massive troubles funding the infrastructure that they feel that they need to put in. And it's because at the heart of it, even without water sensitive urban design, we have an issue with funding our infrastructure. We have a bigger, more general problem, which is with current amounts of money coming through rates and current funding mechanism and current amounts of infrastructure that need to be replaced, we have too much infrastructure, too much works that's required, and not enough money. So from a potential let's cut costs in stormwater treatment point of view, there's some logic to this, but this has to be applied completely across the board if it's going to work. And it does nothing to address the complexity problem that I would suggest is underlying this. The problem that every time that we're essentially chasing our tails, that every time we add a new layer onto this, start with one layer, it causes problems that causes the next, but then this layer causes problems that in this case get solved down in the fourth in the waterways city. It's entirely possible that things that we are doing now under the guise of water sensitive urban design will have their own unintended consequences down the track. Now, increased costs is one of them, but it might even have its own unintended environmental consequences. Some of those could include the fact that we're now trapping quite significant portions of pollutants like heavy metals actually at source in the catchment near people. If you had kids start to play in bioretention systems, who knows what might happen health-wise down the track? I have no evidence to suggest that this is a problem, but if you're trapping heavy metals and hydrocarbons and pathogens and stuff in stormwater treatment systems outside people's houses and kids start digging around in them and, you know, it's a sand pit, right? Tasty bioretention filter media. Maybe there's an unintended consequence there that we don't yet know about. On the other hand, what about the other unintended consequence where a lot of our urban creeks are actually starved of coarse sediment, and sticking a bioretention system on a catchment collects what little coarse sediment is still coming off that catchment and stops it getting into the waterway. Unintended consequence of water sensitive urban design as we currently practice it, potentially creating more problems down the track that need to be solved. So, with that view in mind, cutting costs may be useful, but not entirely. Another way that is presented is this concept of multiple benefits here. So it's saying, okay, if things are too costly to do, why don't we, and if we recognize that they're really costly across multiple aspects of the water cycle, and that these are all inherently related, because ultimately it's all water in one format, why don't we try and just get better multiple benefits out of the same money? So let's try and use that same money to do multiple things, instead of doing one project here and one project there. Again, on the surface, there's some logic to this, and maybe at the end of this, my answer is going to be we need to do bits of everything. But bear with me, because I want to present something new, potentially off to the side. So we're presented with, let's go multiple benefits. The problem that I see with this is, I think, best explained with an analogy here. So I've said in the water space, we have this growth from one thing to another, where what we do in one aspect of our city's transition leads to problems in another that cause a reaction, that leads to further problems that cause a reaction, and then this stage also causes a problem up here in the reaction. I think this isn't too much unlike health. So if we look at health and fitness, a lot of chronic disease out in the world can be traced back to essentially diet and lifestyle problems. Inappropriate food being eaten, and inappropriate amounts and types of exercise being undertaken. And so what can happen at times is people will, because their lifestyle situation's not conducive to health, they start to get a bit sick. They go to the doctor to be looked after, which is absolutely an appropriate thing to do. They go to the doctor, and the doctor's like, look, your cholesterol's high, let's give you some medication for that. Let's give you some statins, for example. Actually, let's keep this. Yeah, we'll use this example, but let's note that it's the general pattern that's of interest here, not the specific illness or specific medications. You got high cholesterol, maybe a bit of a high blood pressure, you might be at a bit of a risk of heart attack. Let's go give you a certain type of medication. You take that medication, but medications have side effects. So some people, when they do this, not everyone, but some people might then start to develop complications. So they go back to the doctor and it's like, well, we gave you this initial medication to treat this thing, but as a result, this is now going a little bit funny, so we'd better give you this other medication to treat that back, right? See how this pattern's really, really similar here. So the initial problem that went wrong was maybe the lifestyle wasn't right. So some things were going not so right in lifestyle, so someone came along and the doctor was like, okay, let's go some medication. To be fair, the doctor probably tried to get the person to change their lifestyle factors, but let's assume that hasn't worked. So then there's some medication, and that helps the situation. That solves the problem from over here, but it has an unintended consequence. So then it's a case of, well, that unintended consequence, what should we do with that? Let's go and add some more medicine. And then we get to a point at some point where it's like, wait, hang on. National health bills are going through the roof. People's health is still continuing to decline. People can't afford medications. People are stuck in this cycle of poverty because of huge medical bills. Saying that multiple benefits will solve our stormwater problem would be akin to, in that situation, going, okay, we're going to solve this medical problem by, instead of having you take 4 different types of pills, which are all treating a side effect of another pill, we're just going to give you one wonder drug that does them all, and that will solve the problem. Because when we give you one of them, we can do it cheaper, and that solves the cost problem. But it hasn't really solved the underlying problem, has it? It hasn't really solved the underlying complexity of the situation every time you chuck another drug on top of it. The root, the ultimate, the elegant solution to that is to go back and change the lifestyle factors. Go back to the very start and change the lifestyle factors. So I see that, and I see the logic in it, but it doesn't strike me, because every time I have seen this played out, you get these sites where there's multiple benefits. I always see sites that turn out really high profile. I see sites where it's like, yeah, okay, we did manage to get heaps out of this, but we also spent an absolute truckload doing it, right? I'm not seeing that solve the problem, and the medical analogy for me is a little bit of a warning that that's not the right direction. Although, of course, if you can get multiple benefits out of something without raising the costs, it's not a bad thing. I just don't think that it's going to solve the underlying root cause, if I'm right that the added complexity over time as we move through this cycle is the root cause of the problem, then the multiple benefit situation doesn't solve it because it's still got all the complexity in it. My argument here, to come to our last slide, is that the answer in this is striving for simplicity and elegance. The answer to this is trying to find the solution that goes back to the source and goes, right, what's actually the source of the problem here? Not what's the symptom. So the symptom is our waterway health is degrading. And the first why to answer that might be because polluted runoff's getting in. And if that's as far back as you go, then build a bioretention system is the correct answer. But if you go back further and you ask why, and we go back to, for example, well, one of the reasons it's polluted is because car brake pads have lots of heavy metals in them, and every time we brake, we drop heavy metals on the road, and that gets into our stormwater and gets into our waterways. Then you start to see, okay, well, is the simple and elegant solution to go and build bioretention systems, or is the simple and elegant solution to go and change car brake pads? And if that's the case, why aren't we thinking about trying to do that? So this hypothesis that I would like feedback on is this. Several questions. What do you think of the hypothesis that the root problem underlying a lot of society's infrastructure funding problems is the fact that we are building more and more and more complexity into the system, chasing one problem after another? And notice and remember that when one level of this, say the sewerage side of it, went and solved a problem caused by the other. So the water supply caused a lot of sewerage to get into cities right outside people's doors and caused public health problems. So then people built sewers to get that away into waterways without treatment, which then caused waterway health problems. But it did solve the local the local public health problem. I can almost guarantee you that no one or very few people who fixed the public health problem there recognized that they were about to cause an environmental health problem at the same time. With this in mind, what do you think of the hypothesis that complexity is the root cause of all our problems? And the reason why it's important to understand that the person fixing this problem probably had no idea they were causing this problem is because as we fix this problem with a bioretention system, it's entirely possible that we are having a whole bunch of other flow-on effects that we cannot predict, and frankly probably shouldn't be expected to predict either, because predicting the future is inherently very problematic and very challenging for people to do. But if we recognize that in the past people have accidentally had flow-on effects, how do we know that we're not accidentally having flow-on effects ourselves? So what do we think of we keep adding complexity to the issue hypothesis as the fundamental underlying problem here? And based on your response to that, what do you think about the hypothesis that the solution to that problem is to build elegance and simplicity into the system? So what I mean by this is going back to the root cause and going, okay, based on what we now know, recognizing that when we only knew this, it was logical to do this. But now that we know all of this, was that step even logical at all in the format that it took? I would argue that the root solution to this will be ultimately a stripping back of complexity out of the system. I'm not talking about a reduction of services. I'm not talking about saying, oh, you know what, public health doesn't matter, who gives a rat's, let's just not do it anymore because this bioretention thing's more important. No. This is me talking about going, okay, we just recognize that that did something that was inherently problematic down here. How do we stop doing that in that way? So we still get the public health outcome, but without the unintended consequence down here. How do we redesign this as one whole system? Now, I know that that concept of redesigning our cities isn't particularly new, but what I'm hoping to bring to the discussion here is a way for us to weigh up when we're looking at, oh, do we just cut costs? Do we do multiple benefits? Do we do this? A way to frame this up and decide which of these actually makes sense. Because in some of the work I'm doing at the moment, that one pops up as a big solution, and that one concerns me. This one on itself doesn't have any fundamental underlying problems, but I just don't think it's big enough at scale to solve the issues if the complexity is at play. But I think simplicity and elegance, which is just blown away, maybe that's a bad omen about the idea. I don't believe in bad omens, by the way. It was just the wind. Maybe simplicity and elegance is the solution. And I would love to get some feedback on that thought. Sweet. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for considering these ideas. I hope to hear from you soon, because I hope to use your thoughts and feedback to further develop and refine this still very immature hypothesis. Sweet. Thank you for tuning in. I will see you next time.
Before you go, our best episodes come from your questions. This knowledge base, these discussions that are Ideanthro improve with your contribution. So if there's a topic, an idea, a concept that you would like us to explore, come and ask us. You know where to find us. www.ideanthro.com/contact. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and that place you get your good podcasts from. You know where to find us. We look forward to hearing from you. We'll see you soon.